What makes a life worth living? What gives it meaning? And how does that change when the time one has left collapses? These are some of the profound questions taken up in a new memoir by a doctor who suddenly faced his own mortality.
And write an indelible memoir, When Breath Becomes Air.
Oh, goodness.
What does he know about living?
Whew.
As a neurosurgeon, Paul Kalanithi was used to dealing with life and death issues. He was, by his own account, a driven man who studied literature and philosophy before turning to medicine, earning 5 degrees along the way. He was near completion of a rigorous residency at Stanford when, at age 36, he got a diagnosis of lung cancer.
And when we packed for the hospital, I was packing, socks and pillows and phone chargers, and he just packed 3 books. He packed Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, Heidegger's Being and Time, and Solzhenitsyn's Cancer Ward. But he sort of had this little stack of books there, and I think it was an early acknowledgement that it wasn't medical knowledge necessarily that would help him most through that time. But that was a really interesting thing to notice. And then he writes in the book, I put on the hospital gown, I lay down in the patient bed, and the future I had imagined evaporated. And I think that was one of the most interesting or striking things about that day, that I think coming face to face with your own mortality is, maybe the biggest challenge that we all face. But at the same time, I hadn't quite realized how much a serious illness in a moment can shift your identity or take away your identity. I sort of came to realize how much of our identities are tied up in our future selves and who we imagine that we're becoming, whether it's seeking an education or having a child or, all the different things that we strive for. I think when that is erased, in a way, a part of you is erased and you have to rebuild yourself.
Paul talks for a couple pages about his beliefs and faith system, and I was wondering what role has faith played for you guys in such a face-to-face encounter with the idea of death and the idea of existential questions, and that a lot of people we enjoy putting off because we can, or we convince ourselves that we can. So
yeah. Thanks for the question. Thanks for being here too. It's interesting because Paul wrote about his faith in the book, and people who are diehard atheists come up to me and say, I really relate to the way he talked about that. And people who are really faithful Christians come up and say, I really relate to the way he talked about that. It's because he's sort of talking about it as it's a journey. It's it's messy.
That jumps off the pages. This is a man who, in addition to going to Yale Med School, studied literature at Stanford, studied the history of medicine at Cambridge, and was in a nonstop search to better understand death, only to find, time after time in the academic setting, the details were unknowable. It wasn't until his diagnosis that the light started to go off for him.
Right. You're right. He was really interested his whole life in mortality as sort of an intellectual, philosophical problem. And then he wanted to grapple with it. So he entered medicine to be a doctor. And then at age 36, he himself was diagnosed with terminal cancer, as you know. And so suddenly it was a very personal, emotional challenge for him.
A gentleman by the name of Brock Chisholm, who was famous within the medical and psychiatric world, he made the statement very clearly. He said, to achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their individualism, loyalty to family and traditions, national patriotism, and religious dogmas. Interesting. He goes on to describe those religious dogmas as he said, the only psychological force capable of producing these perversions, to create these perversions of loyalty and family and patriotism and religion. These perversions, the only thing that can create those things is morality. The concept of right and wrong. The eradication of the concept of right and wrong is the objective. Now you wonder why we have moved into an era where increasingly people say there is no right or wrong, there is no good or evil, there's no truth or falsehood. There are no absolutes, and there is no absolute God to enforce absolute morality. If you think it's right, then it's right for you. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from a lot of different strains, but it's been heavily promoted within academic institutions, within schools, within our children, to create this idea that we can release and let go of the kind of things that usually bind people together, particularly a love for your own country.
Paul definitely would have called himself a Christian at the time that he died, but was an atheist at various points in his life. And it's funny because people who are neuroscientists or atheists or whatever come up to me and say, like, this guy gets me, like I feel the same as he does. And people with a really strong religious faith come up to me and say, like, this guy gets me, I feel the same as he does. And I think it's, Paul's not trying to change anybody's mind in the book. He's talking authentically about a struggle that he went through in his life with faith, and I think a bunch of people are doing that. And so that's kind of a nice aspect to see. But anyway, for him, it was sort of a helpful, I don't know, it wasn't even premeditated. It's just sort of, he was raised in this faith tradition, and then he found his way back to it actually as a med student. It's sort of interesting. And at the same time, one time in medical school, I said, so do you believe in God? And he said, I think it's just as important a question to ask, do you believe in love? He kind of distills that in the book too. But I think he felt that Christianity and the depiction of suffering within Christianity actually was like, and Jesus as a model for human suffering was actually really comforting to him, and that was really interesting to see.
So as society moves away from Christian values, as you said, and you like the views of Nietzsche, for example, who says that will be replaced by ideologies, so totalitarian ideologies.
And hopelessness, don't forget hopelessness.
Yeah. So now that the West has been through those totalitarian ideologies, what happens next, do you think? What's the most likely outcome? Because do we stick with another ideology, and if so, what ideology will that be?
No, I don't think so. I think it's back to the past for resurrection, so to speak.
To Christianity?
Yeah, well, who knows exactly, but, Jung was a very astute critic of Nietzsche, and there aren't very many because Nietzsche was very, very smart, and so you criticize him at your peril. But Nietzsche believed that one potential move forward would be that we could create our own values. But the psychoanalysts, and I would say the biologically oriented psychologists in large part, philosophers as well, have pretty much eradicated that as a possibility because you can't create your own values. I mean, go try. You can do it as an exercise tomorrow morning. It's like you're going to sit down, blank slate that you are, free choice creature that you are, and you're going to create your own values. It's like, well, you're going to lose 30 pounds, maybe that's the first thing, and you're going to reshape your physique by going to the gym 3 times a week, and you're going to start eating properly, and no more of that alcoholic binging or pot smoking, that's out, and you're not going to play any more video games, and you're not going to waste any more time. And you're creating those values, and you lay them out, and then bang, from then on in, that's all you do, is you obey yourself 100%, because you've told yourself to do it. It's like, does that sound like life? Has that ever happened to anyone in the history of the human race? It's like, no, you can't enforce, you're not your own slave, you're not your own puppet. And maybe it would be easier if you were, although you might tell yourself something stupid and go do it, which wouldn't be such a good thing. So you have to contend with your own soul, and that has a structure, that soul.
Well, it's the same question that Solzhenitsyn posed in the Gulag Archipelago to some degree. It's like, do you want to lose your life? What's worse, to put your life at risk, let's say, or to put everything you love at risk, or to lose your conscience? And Solzhenitsyn's conclusion was that there's no suffering greater than that which accompanies loss of conscience. That's hell. There's something very, very profound about that, because one of the things, I've just been writing about this, interestingly enough, it was the prophet Elijah who first seems to have, it's in the story of the prophet Elijah, as far as I can tell, where there's the first intimation that God might speak to human beings, not as the external force of natural power, storms, fire, wind, winter, earthquakes, all the overwhelming natural forces that human beings were subject to, or maybe even not as internal forces that would more characterize some of the other polytheistic gods, like lust or rage or terror, but as the voice of conscience itself, which is described in 1 Kings, which is contains the story of Elijah, as the still small voice. That's the first time that phrase emerges. And so it's the idea that there's a psychological factor, conscience itself, that calls to you, that has a dialogue with you, even more importantly, because conscience doesn't tell you what to do. It hints at what you shouldn't do, right? And it isn't a deterministic force. It's not like when your conscience grips you, you're forced to act in a manner that's in accordance with your conscience. You can choose to violate it. And so there's this idea that God transforms himself or becomes known as the voice of conscience, and that's the link between human beings and divinity itself. And I actually think this is a highly credible hypothesis. And let's say that, well, you need a powerful sustaining meaning to keep you from the bitterness of Cain, and that's to be found in the relationship with something of divine significance. Well, maybe that's mediated through your conscience. And
so
I believe that.
And this relationship is absent within Cain. So he has severed his relationship with consciousness, and that's why
No, not with consciousness, but with conscience.
Conscience. Okay. Conscience.
Right, with conscience. Yeah, well, that's right, because conscience is, imagine that conscience is the manifestation of the instinct for good and evil.
Yeah.
It's what, now, so we can take the argument apart a little bit. A lot of what makes people bitter is that they feel that there is wrong in the world. It might be on a large scale. Society is unfair. The natural world is a catastrophe. Human beings are intrinsically malevolent. The structure of being itself is wrong in some moral sense. Okay, but that's interesting, because they wouldn't be bothered by that if they didn't have some sense of morality itself. Well, what that means is that conscience, even the conscience that's driving them towards their cynicism, is the dawning of the realization of a moral dimension to life.
And that's partly what the psychoanalysts laid out, and I think Jung did that most effectively. If you want to establish values in the face of the death of the past, which is something that's happened many times, not merely in the late 19th century, you have to look inside and discover what those values are. And that is truly a process of discovery. Like, to find out what's meaningful in your life is to take yourself seriously as a mystery. It's like there is something that will grip you. And it might not even be what you choose. In fact, sometimes it's not what now and then you fall in love with the wrong person. You go home and you tear your hair out. It's like, what the hell's wrong with me? How can I do this? It's like, well, you're pulled by forces that are beyond your control. They're deeply, deeply enmeshed inside you. You have to discover who you are. And you negotiate with yourself to find out where are the values. And that is an archaeological expedition, because you are excavating the values of the past. And so then there's a dance between your own soul, but it's still a matter of discovering what it means to be human. And that's not something that's simply invented. It's not that at all. You only believe that if you want to remake men and women in the image of your ideology. It's like you're something you have to contend with. Just like if you have a partner, a romantic partner, it's like they're there. You have to contend with them. You have to negotiate a solution. You have to jointly establish your values on some real basis, and you have to do the same thing with yourself. And so we can't let this go, because the alternative is a nihilism that turns into something catastrophic, or an ideology that's a weak replacement. It's still a religion. It's just an unbelievably shallow and unidimensional religion with none of the grandeur, none of the transcendence, none of the mystery, none of the beauty, none of that. It's just stripped bare, fragmentary religion that you can understand in a week and then convince yourself of the superiority of your arrogant intellect. It's not helpful. So The Jungian critique, Freud as well. No, you can't create your own values. You have to discover who you are. And you do that painfully because you're not your own puppet. You have a nature. And you have to act in accordance with that. And so, well, so that's...
That also characterizes the finite, right? That's the promise of the resurrection, that the resurrection of the body, is that the Christians insist that that transcendent factor exists, and that's the Christ, that's the Word that's there at the beginning of time and at the end of time as the judge in Revelation, right? This transcendent logos that's eternal, but that's no more valuable in some sense than the particularized creature that's subject to apparent permanent death. And you know, it's very difficult for modern people to grant the idea of the bodily resurrection any credence, and it's not something of which anyone can speak, I believe, with any degree of, what would you say it, non-arrogant authority, something like that. But by the same token, the world is a very strange place, and it isn't obvious to me that I've learned to be very cautious in casually dismissing deep and ancient ideas regardless of their strangeness. Mm-hmm. And I do think that, see, the thing that's so interesting about that Christian insistence is that it valorizes the particular. That's unbelievably important, because you could say, well, if it's merely a matter of the eternal, then the particular doesn't matter. But then if the particular doesn't matter, you end up with that kind of nihilistic Buddhism, the suffering that characterizes, or even in the proclivity for Christianity to degenerate into the forms that Nietzsche criticized, which is, well, when you chase everything out into an eternal beyond, it justifies everything terrible that's happening on earth as trivial and insignificant, and relieves you of your moral responsibility for addressing it. You can't, at the very minimum, the idea that the body is resurrected is a valorization of the value of the particular here and now and of the body, and an emphasis on the fact that that has divine value as well and needs to be attended to and cared for properly. At minimum, it's that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there is a precariousness to our being, psychologically and spiritually, as well as physically. Well, that's part of the eternal crucifixion as well, is that constant vulnerability of being.
Yeah.
It's part of the burden of being human.
Yeah.
But the necessary burden, I suppose, in my more, I don't know, what would you call them? I don't know, you have these moments of thinking where they're more metaphysical. In my more metaphysical moments, I suppose, then I do see that God and man are engaged in a partnership to bring about the kingdom of God on earth, something like that. That there's something about that story that's exactly right, that we should be struggling uphill with our burdens towards the highest possible ideal, and that there's something about that that's true, or at least it's more true than anything else we can conceive of.
Yeah.
And so that's the great adventure of life. That's what you want to be called to.